Well, good afternoon, everyone. Just joining us. It is right at the top of the hour. We're going to give it about a minute for everybody to get situated here and logged in, but invite you to begin by jumping into the chat. Tell us your name and let us know where you're tuning in from today. We'll be underway in just a minute. We're doing our best speed reading as the chat goes by. It's good to have all of you with us and to see so many from such diverse places across the country. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and kick things into gear here. Again, good afternoon. It's so great to have you with us as always. My name is Dan Worry. I'm the Senior Director of Early Learning at the Hunt Institute in Cary, North Carolina. We are an education policy resource to the nation's governors and state lawmakers, founded 21 years ago this year by Jim Hunt, who served 4 terms as the governor of North Carolina. The Institute supports education policy from prenatal on up through post-secondary, but here on the first Tuesday of each month, we gather for what we call our Early Efforts web series, and we are focused on my part of the work. The team that I lead is focused on the early childhood portion of that continuum, and we've got a fantastic conversation today around a topic that I've really been hoping to get to on one of these webinars for quite some time, and that is the mental health needs of young children in this country. Want to encourage you here before we introduce the panel to do a couple of things for us here. First is that we will, at a point a little bit later in the hour, turn to your questions. And so invite you as the panel begins. If you have a question for the panel, please enter that into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen there on the Zoom toolbar. And again, would distinguish that from the chat. You can see already how quickly the chat moves during this hour. And so for us to sort of distinguish between the chat and the questions, if you can use the Q&A, that way we'll make sure we don't lose track of your important questions for the panel. Another thing that I want to mention to you is that, as always, we have made the Early Effort series available through closed captioning. And so if that is a service that would be helpful to you, you can find the closed captioning controls at the bottom of your screen as well. And so please avail yourselves of them as may be helpful. So again, we're going to jump in here. We've got a fantastic panel to talk about the mental health needs of young children. I want to introduce you to Dr. Neil Horan, who is the director of the Early Childhood Division at the Center for Child and Human Development at Georgetown University. Dr. Chandra Ghosh-Ippen, who is associate director of the Child Trauma Research Program at the University of California at San Francisco. And Dr. Rob Corso, who is executive director of the Pyramid Model Consortium and a senior research associate at Vanderbilt University. Panelists, it is so great to have all of you with us, and maybe we'll jump into conversation. And Neil, I'm hoping maybe you could help us to set the stage today. You know, we have on this series talked not terribly long ago about the growth, for example, of preschool suspension and expulsion, and see that as a growing concern in the country. We also have seen so many articles, especially over the past couple of years since the dawn of the COVID pandemic, really sort of suggesting kind of a mental health crisis among K-12 students, among college students, that that depression is increasing, that that suicidal thoughts maybe are increasing, especially among older kids. What do we know about sort of the state of mental health when it comes to young children in this country at this current moment?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. I mean, I feel like I finally made it to like Jimmy Kimmel. We finally have we're on your show now and to talk about the stuff we're most interested in. I think there's been a lot more attention on this, and I think in some ways the pandemic sort of highlighted, wow, I've been home with these children, and I'm really paying attention. And one, it's not so easy to be a teacher and childcare provider and all these other sorts of roles that we ended up playing.
Yeah.
What we know is a lot more than we knew 15, 20 years ago. We know much of brain development's happening in those first 3 years. Great opportunity, right? A great opportunity for development of social skills, of problem solving, anger management, friendship skills, sharing, all those kinds of things. It's also really challenging to do if you have been sort of spent your first few years locked up during a pandemic. That also goes for all of our workforce. There's great opportunity in early care and education, home visiting, primary care. And it's all about those relationships. So you mentioned expulsion and suspension. We know expulsion and suspension doesn't happen when there's a really strong relationship between the providers and the family. Walter Gilliam talks about this a lot. And what we know about mental health is that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to help children learn the skills that will carry them through life. And if you learn those skills, all those positive sorts of skills, and the two folks here who are joining me are the ones who are out there helping those skill development efforts around the country. But what we know is there's evidence that the pandemic sort of really negatively impacted social emotional skill development. And there's evidence that maybe it didn't. So we don't have sort of firm evidence about it. What we do know is that it continues to be the critical period of time in brain development and social emotional development. Because when everyone talks about school readiness is about, you can talk to any kindergarten teacher. My mom was a kindergarten teacher for 30 years. Any kindergarten teacher will tell you, I can get children to learn letters, numbers, shapes, colors, things like that. What's much more challenging is if they don't know how to get along with others, follow directions, problem solve, deal with their frustration, things like that. And that happens in those first few years. And I think that that's the opportunity that, and I've seen the names flying by. There's lots of folks here who are doing lots of great work across the country, who are really doing what we're talking about. And so I look at it as a great opportunity, and hope that you sort of spend much of our time thinking about what we can do, not about all the sort of negative problems that are happening. There are clearly things that are happening, and there's great opportunity for us to sort of address them.
It's so interesting that you bring that up. As a former kindergarten teacher myself, I mean, the number of times I've had this conversation that, if you asked, 20 random people walking down the street, what their vision of school readiness entailed, right? I mean, the chances are good that you'd hear things like knowing the letters of the alphabet and counting to 20 or what have you, those kinds of very basic academic skills. Whereas if you ask kindergarten teachers, what is most important to them, it's probably very rare that you would hear those kinds of academic things. And instead, really a focus on the kind of the social emotional development and social skills that children are frequently lacking, and that we find that when children possess those skills, then getting to the academics is not a real big problem. But boy, when when those skills, when the ability to listen and to follow directions and to get along and share and use words to resolve conflicts with peers, those sorts of things are absent. That's where teachers face such a challenge in the classroom. So I couldn't agree with you more on that.
One other thing, Dan, on that question is, I think when we think about the mental health of young children, we have to think about the mental health of the adults.
Yep.
Their caregivers, the folks in our workforce who've been understandably very stressed. And I think we're spending more time now thinking about those adults as well. And I think Rob and Chandra will probably speak to that as well.
Absolutely. So Chandra, let's turn to you. One of the things that Unfortunately, with all of the conversation around adverse childhood experiences, for example, I think that our awareness of the traumas that young children are facing has really grown in recent years. And so your role is so interesting as the associate director of the Child Trauma Research Project. There in San Francisco, you obviously know the importance of preventing and healing that childhood trauma. Talk to us a little bit about trauma, and what are the impacts during the early years, and how is your program helping to support families and service providers both to raise awareness around trauma and maybe also to address its impacts?
Yeah, let me just start by maybe swapping out a word. And instead of trauma, let's maybe say danger. And let's honor that our bodies are designed to remember danger. Because actually, from an evolutionary standpoint, when you've been in danger, you want to remember it because remembering can help you survive if you ever bump into it again. Right. And so, but our bodies are also designed for new learning. And so when a child or a grown-up has experienced danger, we can woo them back to safety if we actually really deeply acknowledge what they've been through and understand that a lot of their behaviors are coming from fear. And I wanted to share a picture. So let me just open my screen here and share a picture. And if you see this picture, what we can acknowledge is that when people, for those who choose to become parents, that's a time when actually our childhood history, nothing reminds you of your childhood like having a child. And if your babyhood or your childhood was fraught, then it makes the world of sense that as you might be becoming a parent, there is both hope and fear. And that what we deserve on this journey is accompaniment. And we deserve community, and we deserve a place where we can share what's inside us because, as Dan Siegel says, what is shareable is bearable. And if you think about the idea of how my fear as a grown-up might be translated to my child, that's not something that we want. But if you imagine that I, for example, grew up and I had a fear of water because I had a family member who drowned, I might transfer that to my child. Now that's, a fear that we might think about, even as we look at this picture. But now I want you to imagine what happens when something actually happens to a young child or a baby, because there's a lot of people who would like to say things like they're too young to remember. They're too young to be affected. And what I would like us really all to hold is actually that is not true. That what happens to you in the early years forms the template for your relationships. And the idea of, am I safe? Am I lovable? Am I capable? And if you think about this also as when something happens to a child, it happens to the parent. It is a relational trauma and it shakes up the parent. And if the hands that hold the baby are shaking, those hands need love and support. Now, as you think about these pictures and you think about young kids, to understand how trauma affects them, what Bob Pynus once told me, he's the head of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, is that you need to shrink yourself down to the size of the child and walk through it at their level. And when you do that, it's really a hard thing to do, but you start to recognize that these little beings that we all love are like sponges that are soaking up the environment. And so if you imagine, even if we take something that unfortunately happens to a lot of kids, but medical trauma, if you imagine that there's a baby who's been in the NICU and maybe they've been intubated, right? A tube has gone down their throat. And we have done this to save their lives. So thanks to all the medical providers who did this and to the parents, But can you all see how when people approach the baby, rather than being immune to the trauma, the baby might go like this, because that is their way of saying, I think you're going to poke me. I think you're going to prick me, right? And that if we understand that, then we know that we need to woo the baby back, and that we know also that when I approach you, you might do that. And that the way that I woo you back is actually by deeply acknowledging and saying, oh, you're scared that we're going to do this. You're worried. And so I'm going to go at your pace so that you can see that when I'm here, that touch can be something delightful. But I understand that you're scared, and you basically titrate the way that you are. And what you're doing actually is something that, very interestingly, it's not exactly a skill, But you are speaking to a part of the nervous system that is sort of our ancient nervous system, which is like our vagus nerve. And you're doing it through your vocal tone and your body posture and through your attunement to the baby. And that as you pull back and go forward, the baby is learning people are reading me and I can be safe. Now, if you have a parent who had a very difficult history and when the baby pulls away, they think, oh my goodness, I'm not a very good baby. I mean, not a very good parent, right? Because they're thinking, I'm really worried about being a parent and now my baby's pulling away. Well, they might misread what the baby is saying and they might take it very personally. And that might mean that it interferes with the way that they woo the baby back because they might take it as a rejection. And so when we do our services, we want to make sure that we're really aware and open the door to the parent's history so we can understand what are the contributions of what the parent has been through that affects how the child is responding, and what are the ways that, that we can help them to kind of also hold what the baby is going through so that we can support them in helping their child to feel safe. And this is also with childcare providers. So children spend so much time with childcare providers, and often we don't connect the story for everybody. And when we think about multiple care providers, it is critical that we all understand the sources of danger for a child so that we can support them in the sources of safety and connection. For example, if a child has been bitten by a dog, it would be really good for the childcare provider to know that the child was bitten by a dog. So when you're out and about and the child is expressing fear, you can reassure them. Now, if that makes a lot of sense, I just also want to think about some people have been bitten by anger because they have seen within their families that when people get mad, all hell breaks loose. Things are bad, people go away. The United States has a domestic violence prevalence rate of 20%. Which means we have to look at this. Worldwide, it's at least 10. In places like Sweden, it's 12%. So interpersonal violence is something that we have to grapple with. And if we believe that children are affected by things like dogs being scary, we have to believe that they're affected by the people in their lives who they love deeply, also having been scary, which means that when anger comes into the room, that's the new learning. When anger comes into the room, we want to think together about what would we like you to learn about anger, that people don't go away, that you're not alone with it, that we can get angry in different ways, and that we want to be able to repair that.
Well, Chandra, bitten by anger is that's a really powerful way of describing that. Really, I'm sure I'm watching the chat. Just a powerful connection for so many. Thank you for sharing, and look forward to talking a little bit more about the work of the center. As we do, you were mentioning preschool teachers and providers. I think, Rob, one of the things that we know, even in this conversation around preschool suspension and expulsion, is that many early childhood educators, I think, feel that they lack the skills in some cases to deal with some of the very challenging behaviors, some of the the anger, for example, that that some young children bring with them to the classroom. And so when we think about what are the resources that are out there to help the early childhood workforce, the pyramid model is one that comes up in virtually every conversation. You lead the pyramid model consortium there at Vanderbilt. Help for the sake maybe of those in the viewing audience who aren't as familiar with the model, bring us up to speed a little bit about what is the pyramid model, how does it work, and who does it work with?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. The pyramid model has been around about the same length of time, really, the Hunt Institute has. In 2001, we were initially funded to create a framework to do the promotion and prevention as well as support when there is challenging behavior. And that was ahead of the study that Neil alluded to, that Walter Gilliam did, that showed you're 3 times more likely to get expelled from preschool than high school. But it certainly fit into the long knowledge base and evidence base we had around what the challenges were for early care providers, families with young children in general here. So in 2001, U.S. Department of Education and U.S. Department of Health and Human Services funded a project that developed the pyramid model called the Center on Social Emotional Foundations for Early Learning. It is a tiered framework. So if you're familiar with school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports, PBIS, or when folks refer to multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS, the framework's the same, thinking about universal, secondary, and tertiary supports. Universal, what do we want for every child in the United States? We want every child in the United States to experience nurturing, responsive caregiving. That's all kids. We want all kids to be in high quality environments, whether that's a high quality childcare, the community-based program like YMCA or Head Start, state-funded pre-K program, or just at their house. We want all children to be in high quality environments that supports their learning and development. The middle tier is really about an intentional focus on teaching the skills that Neil was alluding to. How do we help children learn how to be friends? If only it was so easy to say, be friends, and the 3-year-olds would just magically be friends. If they knew how to be friends, they would be friends. So turns out there's 8 micro skills that children that make friends easy and have a lot of friends have. So how do we teach those to children who need to learn those skills? How do we teach really complex skills like emotional regulation, impulse control, anger management in ways that make sense to a 2-year-old? That's really what the middle of the pyramid is about, the intentional focus on these skills that, as Neil alluded to, are foundational. If we want children to succeed academically, these are the skills that will help them not only thrive in their early childhood years, but also help them with language literacy. I think, Dan, you alluded to that as well. The top of the pyramid really recognizes the need for individualization, and that may be because of behavior challenges, that might be because of disability, it may be because they're an English language learner, it may just be because they have a unique learning need. All of us have things that we learn easier than others here. So the top of the pyramid really recognizes that it's our responsibility to be able to individualize for children in our care and not the other way around. It's not the child's responsibility to have to navigate to be successful in our early care environments here. So that really is the pyramid model, a universal, secondary, and tertiary approach to thinking about how to support the wellness of children and adults. That the relationships piece is not simply relationships with children. What's our relationships between adults and adults, children and children? How do we holistically support that? It sits on the base of effective workforce. And I think the good news for this conversation is we know what works. We know what to do. The hard part is there's a lot of things we have to do all at the same time with most of the time 14, 18 children in our care all at the same time. That's what makes this so complicated here. The pyramid model shifted to more of a state structure building here. I think we came out of the gate thinking it will develop a framework. We'll have some professional development. That obviously, that alone didn't solve the complex challenges that children and families are bringing to our program. So it moved into a statewide systems frame of noting, we're not going to train our way out of this. If only it was so easy. Do more trainings and everything would get better. So we have a system of statewide, community-wide, and program-wide supports that recognizes the systems we need to build, making sure nobody's on an island. If a child has challenging behavior or needs extra support, they're not on an island. If a family needs extra support, they're not on an island. If a teacher or child care provider needs extra support, they're not on an island. That we're really looking at systems so that everybody has some place to go to when they need extra support, extra help. We are launching some new states, but if you are in one of these 41 states, including Guam as a territory here, a state, there's statewide pyramid efforts going on here in your state. Some of our states are brand new or just about to get off the ground, like Kentucky, Wyoming, but most of our states have these systems efforts, really trying to do what Sandra was talking about coordinated systems here to make sure that the adults are communicating with each other, that the child care provider is talking with the Head Start program that they may go into the afternoon, or the home visiting program here, really trying to get all the systems moving in the same direction. So early Head Start, child care, early intervention, early child special education, home visiting programs, all part of what we see is part and parcel of the pyramid model. And at the end of the day, really trying to make sure we see mental health as everybody's business, not just folks who are clinical, that childcare provider is part of the mental health equation here. So lots and lots of free public domain resources to support development of those relationships, to setting up the environments with a social emotional frame and lens, to how do you teach in evidence-based ways these complex social emotional skills, to what it looks like when we're individualizing that support. With Neil's help, we've tried to integrate the work that Chandra does to say, what's it mean if you're trauma-informed, danger-informed, as well as have a prevention promotion focused here so that folks aren't feeling torn. What do you want me to do? You want me to pay attention to Sandra or Rob or Neil? But showing how the framework can pull it all together in one holistic way to say, here's how we support all children in a holistic way here. So that's really been the development and the work of the pyramid model over the last, starting our third decade of work here, to think about this as a systems problem that we're trying to support at each of those levels throughout all of the systems that work with families with young children.
And Rob, I've seen a couple of questions pop up. I think, one big aha for the viewing audience might be from looking at that map is that most everyone watching, at least in the United States, is in a state that has a statewide pyramid model initiative. Where would the viewers go to learn more about what's happening in their state?
There is a clickable map off of the pyramid model website at pyramidmodel.org. If you can't easily navigate who is my point person in your state here, quick email here to me, and it takes not more than 60 seconds for me to make that connection here. Even if your state wasn't shaded in, there's a good likelihood there's pyramid model work. There's just not a state leadership team, so there's likely. So Texas wasn't shaded in, but San Antonio, we have a lot of work going on. So it's still possible, even if the state didn't have a statewide leadership team, that you might see some work at a community, certainly at a program level.
That's great. So pyramidmodel.org.
Pyramidmodel.org.
All right. You all can help by entering that into the chat. I want to remind you here in just a couple minutes we're gonna shift and we'll tackle some of your questions. So please do be putting those. I see we've got a couple of questions stacking up in the Q&A. Chandra, Rob mentioned that we know what to do, right, for these kids. And I failed to ask you earlier on, one thing that I wanted to highlight is the wonderful series of children's books that you have been involved in authoring that relate to some of these topics. Tell us a little bit about the books, but also what is the key in your mind to handling these traumatic topics, maybe with young kids, and helping them to resolve and work through them.
Thanks, Rob. So I'm going to again share a picture just so you all can see the books. They're free. And so if you're looking at them, it's called the Trinket and Sam Story Series. And where it started was really with the hurricane version. So after Hurricane Katrina, we had partners in New Orleans. And what we realized is that there weren't enough mental health providers. And we also realized, as Rob said, that there are these core concepts. There are things that we know, and there are parents who love their kids. And so what's the best way to get it out there? And so we thought about what we would call a population-based intervention. And that's what created Trinket and Sam and the Rainy Windy Day. And then living in San Francisco, after a while, I started thinking about it. I was like, oh, I better get the earthquake version ready. Then a tornado hit Joplin, Missouri, and we developed Trinket and Sam and the Swirling, Twirling Wind. The fires hit California, and immediately within 2 months, we had Trinket and Sam, the Big Fire out. And then with COVID, we had Trinket and Sam Fighting the Big Virus. And now we're working on a flood version. And so these are free books paid for because policymakers funded things like the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, who is our partner in this. You should know that there have been over 400,000 copies that we can track that have gone out, that it is completely free. You just download it from either their website or my website, which is Peplo Productions. And we have a lot of free resources on this website. We have, coloring pages, we have other things, but it's all sort of paid for because of, government funding. And what it is you'll see embedded in there the core principles. So helping children to tell their stories with their loved ones. And part of what we hold is that little beings often have very difficult stories in their bodies. And think about the difference between fear with connection and protection and fear without it. And so if I am scared of a fire, what I really need is a person who I can talk to about that. And what I often tell people is that I, as a therapist, am not important because I am not around when these kids are bringing it up. They're bringing it up, for example, with a fire when they smell a barbecue. They're bringing it up when they hear the siren. We're not there. Parents are there, family members are there, childcare providers are there. And so we want to give away a lot of this information so that that can be really a first step. And then another step is really the connection of some children and families need more. They're dealing with a lot more, it's affecting them. And as Rob said, the top of the pyramid, we need more providers deeply trained to do this. We do child-parent psychotherapy, which is an evidence-based treatment for kids under the age of 6. It's got 5 randomized trials. I also would love to just share our map because I think we're looking to grow this. And, we're looking to really think about where can we train more providers. And so we are also trying to spread this model, which is a deep model throughout the country so that more families can have access. So we are now, we have 39 states hosting trainings, but 43 states where the model is being done, as well as 6 countries. And it's interesting to think of it going to Sweden and Norway because they typically do look at what works and then try to implement it deeply. But just, I think working on this together as a community, so it's not that we're privileging an evidence-based model or privileging what's happening, but making sure that a lot of these things are freely accessible and become common knowledge. And so, just those books also have a parent guide. And we often say, if you're not going to do the book with a kid, don't start with the kid, start with the grownups. Let's us read it and let's us think about what we're seeing and how we can open doors, because really you are the most important people in the lives of children.
Absolutely. Neil, let me turn to you here, and maybe this is a question for the whole panel here eventually. But Chandra mentioned that the books, for example, happened as a result of a public investment. With all that is going on, and one piece of context that that I would add from a personal experience. I for about 15 years prior to coming to the Hunt Institute helped to administer South Carolina's early childhood system. And one of the real eye-opening discoveries to me in that system was that when we needed and really sought to expand mental health supports for very young children in the state, we found that the resources weren't really as available as one might imagine. That there were not necessarily a shortage of mental health professionals, but definitely a shortage of providers who really specialize in the needs of very young children. And so, Neil, what would you suggest from a public policy perspective? We've got policymakers listening in today and always in our programming here at the Hunt Institute. What advice would you give to policymakers if you had the opportunity here in terms of, how could they help to advance this work in their states?
Yeah. Well, I've spent the last 20 minutes listening to things that work, that we have evidence for, that we have clear outcome evidence, research evidence. And it's always struck me that while I think most people would agree that if 80% of what's happening for you happens in the first 3 years, why are we not spending 80% of our money in the first 3 years? Or actually, if you took Rob's triangle, right, if you took that pyramid, if you flipped it upside down, that's how we spend our money. And I think many people would agree, we have to spend money on adult mental health and on adolescent mental and all the other sorts of things. The challenge is we know from return on investment sorts of research that the money spent early on has a huge payoff at the end, meaning we know from Jeffrey Kenna's work in the Harlem Children's Zone, we know from James Heckman, who won a Nobel Prize, we know that this works. The money is harder, because there's so many competing demands. I would imagine that there's some parallel universe, Dan, where there's another Dan hosting a webinar on geriatric mental health, and they're all clamoring about, we need more, we need everybody. It's not like somebody deserves it more. What I would say to policymakers, though, is if we can all agree that it's critical to support children, their caregivers, and the folks who are working with them, then I shouldn't be able to go. I know this seems out of control. I happen to stop at a Dunkin' Donuts. I know you look at me like there's no way, but I stop at a Dunkin' Donuts and I see a sign that says $15 an hour, signing bonus, vacate, and we're paying people more. And I want my people working at Dunkin' Donuts. I just have to say, for all my Massachusetts friends, it's important. But I also think that we need to start to say, if we are entrusting, as somebody who has 4 children, all of whom are in some sort of early care and education setting, we have to entrust, if we're entrusting people with that kind of responsibility, we have to entrust them with pay that allows them to live. We have to think about our workforce. The reason there's expulsion and suspension is not just because there's a large number of children who really don't belong. It's because we haven't adequately supported our early care and education folks in a way in terms of pre-service training, ongoing support, the kind of things that Rob and Chandra have been talking about. And there's a whole host of programs that have been helpful. We heard about National Child Traumatic Stress Network, National Center for Pyramid Model Innovation, which is a sister center to Rob's work. The Center of Excellence, we haven't even mentioned mental health consultation, which is a huge support for all of this. There are huge public investments. And to the questions here about, are there states where this is happening? Absolutely. But we have to start to think about not just the money, but what are we doing at a systems level to help people support one another? So what high quality means in early care and education should be important to somebody in the home visiting world, should be important to somebody in primary care, because it all is the same child and family. And so the more we can start to think about that equitable access to high quality sort of frame across every part of our system, whether you work in the child welfare system, you work in Head Start, you work in home visiting, you work in primary care, equitable access to high quality should be what we're running around doing. And so I think when policymakers start to think about, so is what I'm doing, and I remember distinctly, I think it was in Washington State, Steve Ayos used to, the legislature used to have them do like a return on investment on anything they were thinking about funding. Do we know if this works? Maryland has done this. We know we have outcome data on mental health consultation. Let's increase funding. We know something works. Let's actually look at what works, what has evidence, and how do we support it? In order to do that, you have to support the workforce. You have to think about the coordination and collaboration that has to happen across systems. And you have to think about where children are and who has access to what, because that's been the big issue that we've realized is we can do all of this good work, and then somebody who lives in any of those states that you just saw a map on, there are any number of states where there's not somebody for 200 miles to provide the kind of things that we're talking about. So how do we start to think about lessons learned during the pandemic? Is some people changed what they were doing. We widened the lane of mental health consultants. I think those are the kinds of things for policymakers to start to think about.
I want to definitely jump to the audience questions here in a minute, but Rob and Chandra, I want to give you a chance to sort of weigh in on this as well. Rob, what are you thinking about in terms of advice to policymakers?
Yeah, I think it's worth picking up where Neil left off here. There has been successful investment by policymakers at the federal and state level, and acknowledging that the pyramid model wouldn't exist without federal investment. There are now literally thousands of free resources that exist off of the challengingbehavior.org website that are all public domain, trying to help address this here. Is it enough? Not nearly. I think also kind of jumping off what Neil said, while there are lots of complex challenges out here, our money is best spent here if we have a prevention promotion model and we're not waiting for the problems to occur. Or we're not surprised with the resources that Chandra's put together if there's another fire or if there's another tornado. Of course there's going to be. So let's invest in the promotion prevention work so children can experience that danger, that trauma, and come out okay here. The other piece I'd say is there is a lot of science of what we're talking about here. We are not just being warm, fuzzy early childhood people. We are being rock hard scientists to say, this is where you should be investing your funds if you want positive outcomes for children, adolescents, youth, whether we're talking about third grade test scores, whether we're talking about high school graduation rates, whether we're talking about who winds up having a experience with law enforcement. The research keeps getting more and more solid each year. Invest in early childhood and focus on social emotional wellness here. That is the language of a hard scientist, not of a warm fuzzy. Well, it's both a warm fuzzy early childhood person and a hard scientist that we're coming at this piece here for. And I think that's extra important now, as there's more and more kind of questions around, should we be focusing on social emotional learning, social emotional development? Is that somehow code for things that politicians today are pushing back on here, that we have to be able to come at this from a rational science point of view here, of saying we're focusing on this because there's research and evidence that this is what we should be doing if we want good long-term outcomes for kids and families.
And Rob, that's such an important point too, because I think, I, like you, I certainly have heard lots of pushback, and there's been a lot of controversy around social emotional learning here, even recently. And the refrain seems to sometimes go that we need to just focus on the academics, right? As if it's that straightforward, and that there's not a connection between the two.
Yeah, a big study that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, the Hart and Risley 30 million word gap. We're not going to close that language literacy gap by putting an iPad in a 2-year-old's hands. It all works together. The language, the literacy, the human interaction. That's how we close the brain development gap here, and the language gap. It's a false choice of, do you want me to focus on social emotional learning or academic learning? Because of course the answer is yes. The two go hand in hand, and we need them both.
Chandra, what would you add to our wish list here for policymakers?
I would wish that you would understand what we do. And so there are too many of us hearing stories about children who've seen other people punch each other, choke each other, that have witnessed murders and have not gotten help, that have been sexually abused. And if you really understand what we do, you would take it seriously and you would fund it better. Because otherwise what happens is we train people and then they leave the community mental health settings where they're serving families who have deep needs, and they'll do private practice. The gap in the workforce will continue until it actually is valued. And then part of what burns people out is not the families or the work, actually, because when we become competent, we're very much like firefighters. Firefighters sit in burning buildings. They go into homes that are in jeopardy to support families in getting out. We as trauma therapists are the same, but what burns us up is the systems challenges. It burns us up when we actually see our colleagues like childcare professionals not being supported and that they can't meet with us because we need that time to partner. It burns us up when our funding streams suggest that we have to stop, or that there's no way to serve the parent who is severely depressed and can't get up because we don't have the right code. There are a lot of things that we crack because we know that sometimes the best way to support a child is to support the parent, and that it's hard because the parent doesn't want to go into an adult mental health treatment, but they will absolutely get support from their child parent person. And we just need to figure out creative ways to be able to seamlessly flow them into services with billing. We need to be able to ensure that, as we're serving pregnant people, that then we can also be able to have policies that allow them to serve them as they might age out of that, but they have a child and their relationship is still in jeopardy. And so those are some of the things. And we need to also look at greater investment in that birth to 3 period, because truly that's when your stress response system is being laid down. That is when your template for relationships is being formed. We invest a lot at the later end because I was actually in Australia meeting with people, and they were supposed to be talking about how we can better support young children. And they weren't able to meet because there was a teenager on the roof the day before. And I'm just sharing this because it was so poignant to hear that, because of course, when there's a teenager on a roof, somebody needs to attend to it. But what's happening is we're dropping the babies early on. and that they're growing up to be the teenagers on the roof. And so how can we have a society that absolutely attends to the teenager there, but does not drop the babies? And so I want us to engage in this dialogue deeper, because as everybody said here, it's not an or, it's an and. And so we just need deep thinkers who aren't just fighting for what we believe in, but are in fighting for the good of all of us.
Well said. Thank you, Chandra. Let's jump into the audience questions. I will flag that we've got about 15 minutes left. Panel, we've got a good list of questions here, so maybe we can do kind of speed round here of some sort of shorter answer questions so that we can get through as many of these as possible. Amber has an interesting question in the chat, though, that I think piggybacks a little bit off of this question of what we would suggest to policymakers. Neil, she's asking, is there a state that is really sort of an exemplar in your mind here, the state that's really doing, I'm sure part of the answer is that, you know, every state has places that can improve, but is there some place that you would point to right now as an exemplar? And if so, what are they doing particularly well?
I see what you're doing here, Amber and Dan. You're trying to get me in trouble with 49 other states and territories. I like your strategy. Which one's your favorite child at? I'm not. So yeah, I think there's a number of states, and Robin and Chandra should jump in because, as you see, they're also in those places. You know, I think that Illinois is an example of a place that is starting to think about some of the things that I've seen in the chat around mental health consultations, not just for early care and education. We got to make sure it's happening. It's also in home visiting. We have to think about how are we integrating pyramid model work with all the other things that are happening there. I know Amber is not sorry, because I think it's actually a good question, but I think that's one example. I think Maryland is doing very good work. I think there are 10 or 15 other places that have at least moved in a direction where you'd be like, wow, look at what they're doing. California is another example. Arizona actually has done some really interesting work around mental health consultation. So it's not a red or blue thing either. I just want to make sure that that's clear that and many places, Illinois and Maryland being good examples, have sort of had Republican and Democrat governors, and they've sort of continued that work, which I think Rob could also speak to, and Chandra around. I don't know that it actually has to do as much with the politics in everything. There are examples of where it's sort of, you can see it across party lines.
Right.
I'll
Were you gonna add in, please?
Yeah, I'm going to give a shout out to my home state, California, in particular to the work of Alex Briscoe and the California Trust, and the change and reform in terms of we can now serve young children who have been through incredible trauma without a diagnosis, that it is enough that they have been through what they have been through to warrant services. So if they have seen severe domestic violence, traumatic bereavement, those kinds of things. And so what that does is it allows us to kind of avoid pathologizing them, that what you're really saying is it's the experience that's problematic, not the child. And that is beautiful. And then I really want to honor the state of Minnesota, because thanks to really great work in that state, it's been a leader in the field of early childhood mental health. There are folks like Catherine Wright who changed policies so that we start off by doing what would be considered the gold standard infant mental health assessment, a DC 0 to 5 assessment, where you're really be able to get funded to observe, to partner with parents, to really do a thorough assessment. And then they've also supported numerous evidence-based models, not just child-parent psychotherapy. And they've looked at a statewide way of disseminating it, really mapping it out and thinking about how do we fund grantees to deliver these services, and how do we continue to gather the evidence, because thinking about different diverse groups that you're serving, is it really working for them? So there's many other stunning examples, as Neil said, but these are a couple of examples that sort of just stand out in my mind and heart.
Rob, anyone you want to
I'll
shout
take
out?
30 seconds here. Yeah, it's a hard question. No state has it all figured out. I think that's fair to say here. I think there's states that if you ask me who's doing a really good job at family childcare, who's doing a really good job getting all the Head Start context together here, that's a little bit easier to answer that. Iowa got every early Head Start grantee to do pyramid model. There's maybe some easier ways to think about it. It's worth a shout out to New York, who helped put a data system together that we're trying to have a nationwide data system to collect suspension expulsion data. Who's getting in trouble? Can we see the patterns of by race, gender, disability? So there's certainly in each state a pocket of things that are going well, and each state places where there's big gaps and holes here. But I think that's the nice part about what we're trying to do is share across state lines. If this worked for you, let's make sure another state knows about it so they don't have to recreate that from scratch here.
Chandra, there's a question in the chat that might be a good one for you, asking how might a parent best support and discuss their child's mental health needs with a teacher? What's the best way for a parent maybe to have that conversation about maybe mental health concerns with an early childhood teacher?
First, I think I would flip that and say, how are we as mental health providers opening the door to parents to do that? Because it takes a lot for a parent to come. But I think I might just start by saying there's some things that I want you to know about my child's experience so that you can help them to feel safer. And then you can decide whether you give them the Cliff Note version or the detailed version, where the Cliff Note version might be, there have been times when people have been scary. And a more detailed version. And so my child worries when they hear loud voices. So really what you're doing is, we have this thing called the child parent psychotherapy triangle, where the left-hand side is the experience and the right-hand side is the symptoms. And so you're doing an allusion to that, where you're saying, my child has had people who have sometimes left. And then you might say the right-hand side might be, so they might be really sensitive to when teachers aren't around. Or you might say, my child has had grownups who often get sick. And on those days when people get sick, they kind of come to school, and it's like, instead of them, a tiger comes to school. And so I would want to let you know when those happen. And maybe we could have a little bit of a code together. It could be a color code or an animal code or something like that. But you start a dialogue, and then you might see how the provider responds, and you might see whether it makes sense to say a little bit more. One of the things that we know in trauma is that when you have experienced danger, there are things that remind you of danger, right? And so what's important is that the people caring for you are aware, oh, these are the things that make you worry. Like, what if you've been in a car crash? Wouldn't it be important that your provider knew that you'd been in a serious car crash, so that if you were playing with toy cars and you were smashing them against the wall, the provider wouldn't say, oh, that's just behavior. They would say, oh, no, this kid has been in a car accident. And that's the beauty of when grownups connect, is we understand better what the kids are communicating, and that we catch it better and we can restore their sense of safety better.
That's great. Neil, a question directed to you in the chat here. You mentioned the use of mental health professionals, and the question is around what strategies might you suggest for communities that maybe are really lacking in those mental health professionals in rural communities, for example?
Dan, did Amber ask it again? Is she just setting me? I'm just joking. So I think that it sort of goes back to this question of what states, because I would tell you there are a number of other places to look, and they are places where that is the issue. New Mexico is a great example of this. If you're not paying attention to New Mexico right now and what their governor and Elizabeth Graginski and all their folks are doing, you're missing something. Tennessee has one of the biggest infant mental health associations. Alabama are places that have these sort of issues around addressing the needs of folks in rural communities. Arizona, similarly, Navajo Nation. I think that part of this is to start to think about what is it that we're trying to do. And to that end, we've actually, on our mental health consultation center that we have at Georgetown, we're doing sort of reverse technical assistance. We're going to find the folks who would never come to us and say, you might need some help figuring this out. You're in a really, we've actually did it by looking, and I would say we, but I want to give full credit. Our partners at Child Equity Project and our folks on our team have said, I think there are school districts where the expulsion suspension rate is super high. Let's go to them. Let's see if there's anything we can do to help them, and start to identify. And to the specific question, it's to start to think about being realistic, which is, if we think that there's evidence that things like the pyramid model or mental health consultation or any host, there's a wide range of things. These are two, child parent psychotherapy and the pyramid model, are great examples of things that you may want to build into your system. I think that folks get caught up, Dan, on I need to what you need to have is what families need and what the workforce needs. And that may be these particular evidence-based practices, it may be something different. And then if that's what we need to meet the needs of children and families here and our workforce, then how do we go about doing it? So mental health consultation. Well, we don't have a lot of evidence about not doing mental health consultation in person, but now we do because we had a pandemic and we start to figure that out. We don't have a lot of evidence about it, but boy, there's been a 3-year forced experiment on how do we shift how we provide mental health supports that I think we're gonna get a lot of research. I know folks in Louisiana like Allison Trigg and others have been looking at what's the pivot that we made and did it work? Those pivots that were made during the pandemic to deliver things, and Rob's work around all the kinds of e-learning that can be done and training that can be done, I think is an opportunity for folks to start to think about the delivery of services in a very different way than the traditional, I must have this person and I have to somehow get this person and this person sitting in the same room. To me, that's always best about relationships. I also like to be realistic. There's great work happening. Navajo Nation has a Project Launch Grant. They're doing lots of pyramid model work. They're starting to think about in this very, rural nation, how do we do this? I think there are great examples of it.
I want to throw out one more question to all of you, and we'll see who wants to jump in. But I think Barbara has a really interesting question here, saying more younger children are now experiencing early childhood education and care that is provided by public school districts. And so what systems are in place to ensure that their mental health needs are being met by a system that is traditionally used to serving a little bit older children? So what do we need to know in particular? What do school districts need to know about serving the mental health or meeting the mental health needs of young children in particular? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I'm happy to start. It's certainly part of what we set out to do 22 years ago, have a seamless, holistic service system that fit for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers that was conceptually holistic to school-wide world, so that it would blend into kindergarten, into first and second grade. So while this is a work in progress, I think you see lots of efforts of what's this look like in state-funded pre-K. What's this look like when we acknowledge or see that principal, who's now working with 3 and 4 year olds, also has to integrate into a school-wide system of 5, 6, 7 year olds here, particularly with the kindergarten transition here. We just got $11 million project to do Pyramid Goes to Kindergarten to try to help that seamlessness work here. But I think importantly, the pyramid model was set up to say, let's not push down the big kids school-wide stuff into the early childhood. Let's design this for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. And more so what I'm glad to see is we're pushing it up into kindergarten. We're pushing it up into first grade as opposed to the other way down here. But that's certainly no doubt it. Neil called out Illinois. Illinois is a great example where I think they're trying to make sure that the mental health consultant is just built into their state-funded pre-K here, and that social emotional is not an afterthought, that's built into the mandatory staffing that you have to have, similar to Head Start.
Now, I was just about to say, Dan, because Head Start is a comprehensive community-based program that is already in school districts and is connected and is trying to figure out what's the policy in this school district as it relates to, we actually have all of our Head Start program performance centers. So I would say, not because Head Start is the greatest, it is, but it's one great example of a program that already exists within school districts and that's had to wrestle with this a little bit.
Chandra, anything you'd add on the sort of distinction about the needs of young children in particular?
A lot, but I would think about how older children can often share their distress with words, and younger children are going to share it in their behavior. And so that means that we're really going to have to rethink how we look at behavior when there's distress. And I don't mean to like plug a book that I wrote, but there's a free version out there. It's called Once I Was Very, Very Scared. I would really recommend that every educator maybe just take a look at it, because when you think about how do we show up when we're scared, some of us might hide like turtles. Some of us might dissociate like Meerkat in the story. Some of us might bark and growl like a dog. And so there are lots of different ways that we show up. We've been taught and socialized, unfortunately, in part because of prior mental health, to look at this as behavior that we need to get rid of, as opposed to look at this as communication. And I think pyramid model, Head Start, that's something that we're really sharing. It's not what's wrong with you. It's not what you're doing. It's what are you telling us? What are you trying to tell us? And then how can we partner with your grownups to have a better flow of communication? That would be a really different and a needed framework to spread that is like critical from an early childhood lens.
Chandra, thank you. I know we are just about out of time. I want to take a moment, though, to plug three websites that I think were important. Chandra, remind us of the website where your children's books can be found.
Sure, it's called Piplo Productions. So if you Google PIPLO Productions, you'll find it easily. And basically, he's the Kenny of our stories, for those of you who like South Park.
And Rob, pyramidmodel.org.
Yeah, and a second one, challengingbehavior.org. That's the national center that's currently funded, the National Center on Pyramid Model Innovations.
Great. Neil, anything you'd like to?
Yeah,
plug?
I mean, I was going to say nctsn.org, but also our mental health consultation center, iecmhc.org, where I think you're going to find a lot of information that'll be helpful.
Fantastic. The last website that I would plug is youtube.com, because that is where several of you have asked the question in the chat and have really appreciated, I know, this conversation, have asked if it's possible to get a video and to share with colleagues to watch afterward. If you go to YouTube, usually within 24 to 48 hours after all of our early efforts websites or webinars, you can find the recordings there. If you go to YouTube, search the Hunt Institute and go to our page, and you will find not only our early efforts webinars, but all of our great webinar series. So you can always go back and rewatch and share those. So look for this conversation here within the next couple of days. Can't thank you all enough. Panelists, Dr. Rob Corso is Executive Director of the Pyramid Model Consortium at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Chandra Ghosh Ippen is the Associate Director of Child Trauma Research Program at the University of California at San Francisco. And Dr. Neil Horan is Director of the Early Childhood Division at the Center for Child and Human Development at Georgetown University. Thank you, all three of you, for taking time out of your busy schedules to contribute. I hope you have seen throughout the chat just how gratifying this conversation has been to those who are watching. And we are grateful to all of you as well. We know your schedules are very busy, so thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to tune in and join us. Want to remind you, we will be back actually on a special date in June. Monday, June 12th, we will be pulling together a panel inspired by the latest working paper from Harvard's Center on the Developing Child, which is called Place Matters. It's about how the environments that we create for young children help to shape their healthy and productive development. And that extends to things like climate and things like the economic settings in which they exist, things like racism and other social aspects of the setting. So a good conversation coming up Monday, June 12th. We will be back together. Thanks to all of you again for taking the time to be with us. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.